The world has looked on with shock and horror at the Jewish bombardment of innocent civilians in Palestine over the last few days. Apparently even Israel thinks their actions are indefensible, since on May 15, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, destroyed a building housing the Associated Press, AP, and other media outlets in Gaza with the intention of stopping images of Palestinian suffering from reaching the rest of the world. Following the attack on the AP, Israel stepped up its bombing of civilian targets, killing dozens of Palestinians with airstrikes on populated streets. But the Zionist strategy entails more than simply brutally punishing Palestinians in other Arab populations that stand up to them. They also utilize an extensive network of Jewish-run NGOs and refugee resettlement agencies in the West to empty the Middle East of potential opponents. Since the creation of the Jewish state in 1948, refugee resettlement outside its borders has always been a major strategic goal. A 2013 article from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz revealed secret archival documents showing that from the very beginning, Zionist Jews saw Europe as the destination of choice for the Arabs they had displaced. In the first half of the 1960s, the Foreign Ministry continued to examine plans to encourage the emigration of Arab refugees from the Middle East to Europe, particularly to France and Germany. One option that was considered was to find them jobs in Germany, which was then in dire need of working hands. During 1962, Israeli officials examined the possibility of finding employment for Palestinian refugee laborers in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The initial checks done for this plan, known as Operation Worker, and the correspondence involved were kept completely under wraps. This plan was eventually tabled since then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir feared it could generate a huge backlash from the German people. In the 1960s, Israel was considerably less powerful and secure than it is today, so such bold plans had to be put on hold until later. But it demonstrates that foisting the Arabs on Europe as a form of racial revenge was on the minds of the Jews in Israel. From the very beginning, demographics have always been at the forefront of Israeli policy, and their control over Western governments has long been used to ensure that Jews remain a demographic majority on their newly seized territory. Meir leveraged Jewish power in Washington to scuttle a 1961 plan spearheaded by President Kennedy to offer resettlement in Israel to the then 1.1 million Palestinian refugees displaced by the 1948 war. In late 1961, in the wake of President Kennedy's initiative, Dr. Joseph Johnson, from the Carnegie Endowment, was appointed a special representative to tackle the problem and to work with the parties involved to come up with a solution. The plan he devised minus to distribute questionnaires to the Palestinian refugees and permit those who wish to return to Israel, subject to security considerations minus stirred deep fears in Jerusalem. Meir, who was appalled by the idea, wielded all the influence at her command in Washington in order to ensure that the plan met a quick death. The clean break. The entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict is beyond the scope of this article, but the roots of the current refugee invasion can be traced back to the year 1996 when the so-called neoconservative movement was formalized with the publication of the now infamous memo, A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm, by several Jewish foreign policy analysts at the Israeli Institute for Advanced Strategic and Political Studies in Washington, D.C. The authors included well-known Jewish warmonger Richard Pearl, and the Jew David Wernzer, who would go on to be the Middle East policy advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney during the George W. Bush administration. The Clean Break memo recommended that Israel break with its old strategy of using the United States simply for defensive military aid and diplomatic cover, and instead start an aggressive war against the entire Arab world and Iran using the U.S. military as a proxy army. In particular, it recommended taking out Iraq and Syria. Israel can shape its strategic environment in cooperation with Turkey and Jordan by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. This effort can focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambitions. A year later, in 1997, Jewish Zionist intellectuals William Kristol and Robert Kagan set up the now infamous Project for the New American Century, PNAC, which recommended the United States engage in a massive military buildup to be used for pushing democracy around the world. Of the 25 signatories to PNAC's statement of principles, 15 were Jewish and 10 served in the George W. Bush administration, including Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. Richard Pearl has also served as chairman of PNAC. PNAC's focus was on regime change in Iraq, though they acknowledged that without some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, this would be difficult to sell to the American people. That event came on 9/11, and the U.S. subsequently invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 at the behest of the Jewish Zionist warmongers in the Bush administration. Endless war. According to a 2006 interview with retired General Wesley Clark, the decision to invade Iraq was made 2 weeks after 9/11, and there were even more ambitious plans in the works to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Playing into popular conspiracy theories, Clark claimed this strategy was somehow connected to oil. He failed to mention that the plan he described had already been laid out in the Clean Break memo and PNAC policy papers written by various Jewish Zionist officials in the Bush administration, all of which placed the issue of Israel's security significantly ahead of oil issues. In fact, oil politics were mainly viewed as an impediment to Israel's interests due to the strategic leverage oil has offered to Arab countries in Iran. The issue of oil has always been used to distract Americans from the real reason for their government's seemingly insane foreign policy in the Middle East. If the U.S. simply wanted secure access to oil, the last thing it would do would be to start wars and topple governments, thereby creating significant disruptions to world oil markets. Oil is often cited as the motivation for America's long-standing policy of support for the barbaric regime in Saudi Arabia, making a farce of its claims to care about human rights and democracy. But with the Iraq War, the U.S. showed it is more than willing to take out major oil-producing states if Israel requires it. The long-standing friendly relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel is a far better explanation for the U.S. stance towards that country. In 2011, civil wars broke out in Syria and Libya, both of which were fomented by the U.S. acting on behalf of Israel. The nauseating refrain of supporting democracy has been trotted out by the U.S. for years as a threadbare excuse to arm and fund terrorist militias in Syria to try to remove Syrian President Bashar Assad from power, while pretending to fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria ISIS terrorist group. A 2012 email published by WikiLeaks from current Biden administration National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton clearly outlined the U.S. position regarding Islamist terrorist groups. Sullivan made the astounding statement that Al-Qaeda, who the U.S. claims perpetrated the 9/11 attacks that killed 3,000 Americans, is on our side in Syria. The last item Sullivan mentions refers to a Reuters report that says this: Al-Zawahiri urges Muslim support for opposition. Al-Qaeda leader Al-Zawahiri called on Muslims in Turkey and the Middle East to aid rebel forces in their fight against supporters of Syrian President Assad in an sick video recording. Al-Zawahiri also urged the Syrian people not to rely on Turkey, or the United States for assistance. Sullivan's email puts the lie to all public statements from Washington that the purpose of intervention in Syria is to fight against radical Sunni terrorist groups. The fact that the Jewish-owned U.S. media completely ignored this earth-shattering revelation is a testament to its bias and corruption. The U.S. has also engaged in numerous bombings of Syria over the years, usually at times when the Assad government was poised to win a major battle and take back a chunk of its rightful territory. The continued presence of U.S. troops and mercenaries in Syria, along with funding for Islamist rebel groups in occasional bombing, is meant to prevent Assad from retaking his country. If the U.S. really wanted ISIS defeated, the obvious strategy would be to leave Assad alone to crush them with the assistance of Russia and Iran. This policy would also have the benefit of actually being popular with American citizens, a fact that was cynically exploited by President Trump to win election in 2016. For its part, Israel has provided medical aid to ISIS and other terrorists fighting Assad, and in 2019, Israeli military official Gadi Eisenkot publicly admitted that Israel had been arming and paying monthly salaries to ISIS terrorists. In 2011, Libyan President Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was murdered by U.S.-backed terrorists after an 8-month civil war. That the U.S. was behind this assassination is well known and not controversial. In her role as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton unabashedly celebrated Gaddafi's murder during a 2011 television interview in which she exclaimed with psychotic glee, "We came. We saw. He died." Gaddafi understood that Israel was behind the Western aggression against his country and attempted to save himself and his government by bypassing the U.S. and appealing directly to Israel and influential American Jews. According to Israeli sources, in 2011 he sought to plead his case to Israel and to the Israel lobby, which controls foreign policy in the U.S. When the Libyan regime was teetering on the brink due to the uprising and the damage from the UN-imposed Lockerbie sanctions first implemented in 1992. She added, Gaddafi desperately made extraordinary overtures to the Jewish lobby in the U.S. and to Israel as well, while the Jewish-owned media in the U.S. exclusively focused on alleged human rights abuses by Gaddafi as the motivation for removing him from power. Israeli strategists have been more honest and realistic. Writing in 2016, Dr. Raphael Olich, a strategic analyst for the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies in Israel, reiterated Israel's commitment to its long-term strategic goal of removing all oppositional governments no matter the human cost. With regard to the global aspect, the Libyan issue raises several concerns. Firstly, there are question marks regarding the actual ability to enforce regimes of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction on rogue states. Secondly, one may ask, would it be better to accept the stable regime of tyrants such as Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, Assad and the Ayatollah regime in Iran, or should those tyrants be toppled despite the ensuing process where their countries disintegrate, which involves severe violence? As much as we may regret the situation in Syria and Iraq, it seems, at least from the Israeli perspective, that the second option is preferable. It is easier to confine and the situation may stabilize eventually. Despite the misery and death throughout the Middle East caused by the Israeli strategy of regime change, Israel sees no reason to back off this policy. And why would it? Israel itself has remained remarkably secure throughout the chaos and has even increased its power and improved its diplomatic position. The refugee crisis, Israel's wars and interventions in the Middle East, working through its U.S. proxy, were the direct catalyst for the European refugee crisis, which boiled over in 2015 and has led to violence, terrorism, rape and political repression against native Europeans. The two major points of entry for refugees and migrants to Europe are Greece and Italy. The U.S.-Israeli orchestrated fall of Gaddafi in 2011 opened up a major route for refugees from the Middle East and Africa to flow into Europe. According to the Washington Post, 400,000 migrants from the Middle East and Africa flowed into Italy from Libya between 2014 and 2017 due to the overthrow of Gaddafi. Since the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya, the number of migrants crossing the Mediterranean has soared as people have taken advantage of a vacuum of authority to set sail from the country's northern coast. A network of human smugglers who facilitate the traffic has expanded from the tip of North Africa down to countries such as Niger and Sudan. Contacts for smugglers circulate on Facebook and WhatsApp in major cities across Africa. Since 2014, more than 400,000 migrants and refugees have crossed the Mediterranean from Libya to Italy. This was a reversal of what had been a successful joint effort between Gaddafi and Europe to block migrants from reaching European shores. In 2004, Gaddafi began offering to control refugee flows as an incentive for normalization agreements with European states. In 2010, he prophetically stated that Europe would turn black without his assistance. Back to 2004, Gaddafi began making deals with individual European states to control the tide of migrants. In August 2010, he visited his friend Silvio Berlusconi, then president of Italy, in Rome and said Europe would turn black without his help. Tomorrow Europe might no longer be European, and even black, as there are millions who want to come in, Gaddafi said. What will be the reaction of the white and Christian Europeans faced with this influx of starving and ignorant Africans? We don't know if Europe will remain an advanced and united continent or if it will be destroyed, as happened with the barbarian invasions. These deals were a success. With the help of Gaddafi, the flow of migrants and refugees into Italy was drastically cut in 2009. In June 2009, he signed a friendship agreement with Italy that involved joint naval patrols against migrants in Italy, handing over migrants captured en route to Europe to Libya, no questions asked. The number of Africans caught trying to illegally enter Italy fell by more than 75% that year. This mutually beneficial arrangement between Italy and Libya was destroyed by Israel and the US, resulting in Gaddafi's morbid prediction coming true in 2015. The Italian government has attempted to revive agreements with Libya in recent years to stem the tide of migrants. These attempts have been met with legal challenges. The British NGO Global Legal Action Network, GLAN, filed a suit against Italy in the European Court in 2017, alleging human rights abuses. GLAN's legal advisor is Itamar Mann, a Jewish Israeli legal professor that teaches refugee law in Haifa, Israel. There are about 6.6 million refugees from the Syrian civil war worldwide, 1 million of which are in Europe. The peak years for refugee arrival in Europe were 2015 to 2017, when about 900,000 Syrians entered, mainly through Greece. The displacement of the Syrian people serves a strategic goal for Israel by denying the Assad government of both human capital and potential recruits for its military. According to Pew Research, a disproportionate number of refugees in Europe are military-aged men. Israel aid workers helped to land a migrant boat in Greece. Israel and Jewish-run NGOs in the West are the main facilitators of the movement and resettlement of Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi and Afghani refugees in Europe. All 4 countries have been destabilized through war and sanctions by Israel and the U.S. IsraAid, the Israeli Refugee Agency, has operated the refugee centers on the Greek island of Lesbos since 2015. Greek refugee aid centers are mainly operated by Israelis. In Lesbos there is an Israeli school for Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi and Afghan refugees, and it is all part of a joint plan to revolutionize the concept of Tikkun Olam and Jewish volunteering around the world. Israeli reporter Liat Osmo quoted a Syrian refugee identified as age 20, from Aleppo, arriving on Lesbos in 2019. My whole life, all through my childhood in Syrian schools, I was taught that the Israelis are the enemy, and then the first thing I see when I approach the Greek coast is the Star of David on the shirts of Israelis who reach out and place me on the ground. Osmo goes on to say that the program to resettle refugees in Western countries will reach all over the world and involve several other Jewish agencies. This is made possible by a $66 million investment from the State of Israel. The concept of working to build a better world is now being adopted by a major Jewish organization in conjunction with the State of Israel. The Jewish Agency is now working with the Mosaic United organization on a joint project that is expected to dramatically increase the number of young Jews involved in giving back to their local community. To American Jews, this is known as Tikkun Olam, or healing the world. This Jewish concept became a central tenet among the fourth-generation descendants of Jewish immigrants to the United States. The projects will be implemented all over the world, from Puerto Rico and Greece to Nepal, Mexico, India and Ethiopia through organizations such as IsraAid, Project 10, Tevel Bezedek and more. For the most part, the only thing that makes Jewish students around the world think about their Jewish identity is when there is a BDS, the anti-Israel boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, demonstration on campus, or an anti-Semitic event somewhere around the world, says Rabbi Benji Levy, CEO of Mosaic United. Such incidents distance them from the desire to be Jewish or associated with Israel. Levy says the project was adopted by the Israeli government several years ago under the auspices of the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. The government will invest $66 million, which is a third of the budget, he says. Rabbi Benji Levy welcomes Israel's enemies to the Greek island of Lesbos. Germany has taken on far more refugees of Jewish conflicts than any other European state. Against the will of the German people, Angela Merkel famously promised to take in 500,000 refugees per year in 2015. Israel's footprint can be felt in Germany as well, where Israeli NGOs provide Arabic speakers with language lessons and find them work opportunities. In 2018, Merkel presented IsraAid with an award for their work on integrating Arabic speakers into Germany. On their website, IsraAid boasts of the extensive programs they have set up in Germany to facilitate the integration of refugees while leaving out any mention of the Jewish state's responsibility for the crisis in the first place. IsraAid has been operating in Germany since 2015, when 1 million asylum seekers and refugees reached the country, most fleeing the brutality of the Syrian civil war and the threat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. IsraAid Germany's programs include refugee youth leadership groups, post-trauma, psychosocial support for children using expressive arts therapy, and a special program supporting survivors of the Yazidi genocide. IsraAid's team in Germany is a multicultural mosaic of Arabic, Hebrew, German and English-speaking psychologists, social workers, art therapists and educators. They utilize their international experience and intercultural approach to promote the sustainable well-being and integration of refugees in Germany. IsraAid's global response includes sustainable programs to build resilience, provide education, combat gender-based violence, advance child protection, improve sanitation and offer livelihood opportunities. Since the height of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, IsraAid has provided medical, psychosocial and educational support to over 100,000 refugees in Greece and Germany alone. Many refugees fleeing war and persecution in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq and Syria for countries like Germany enter Europe through Greece. In Lesbos, the Greek island where many refugees first arrive after a harrowing sea journey from Turkey, IsraAid provides medical care to new arrivals on the shoreline and operates the School of Peace, the only institution offering mother tongue education in Arabic, Congolese French, Farsi and Kurdish, with more than 200 students every week. Through our work with IsraAid, we have seen the power and potential of the refugees we work with as they write a new story for themselves in their communities. It is a story of learning new languages, of adjusting to new surroundings. It is 500 people, Arabic, Kurdish, Farsi and French-speaking Muslims and Christians, celebrating Eid al-Fitr in a Greek school run by an Israeli humanitarian aid organization. Israel gushes with humanitarian rhetoric when talking about hosting an Eid al-Fitr celebration in Europe for Muslims fleeing Zionist wars, but such a celebration is totally unthinkable in Israel. In 2021, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, spent Eid al-Fitr bombing Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The previous day, fanatical Jews were recorded dancing in Jerusalem because they thought one of Islam's holiest mosques was on fire. Any nervousness expressed by Jews over the influx of foreigners into Europe has revolved solely around the potential negative impact on European Jews. The negative impact on native Europeans is only considered through the danger, from the Jewish perspective, of galvanizing nationalist opposition. In a paper for the liberal Brookings Institution in 2015, Daniel Byman, professor of Jewish civilization at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., said that the solution to this problem was long-term integration of the refugee populations in Europe. If the refugees are treated as a short-term humanitarian problem rather than as a long-term integration challenge, then we are likely to see this problem worsen. Radicals will be among those who provide the religious, educational, and social support for the refugees, creating a problem where none existed. Indeed, the refugees need a comprehensive and long-term package that includes political rights, educational support, and economic assistance as well as immediate humanitarian aid, particularly if they are admitted in large numbers. If they cannot be integrated into local communities, then they risk perpetuating, or even exacerbating, the tensions between Muslim and non-Muslim communities in Europe. The influx of refugees and migrants into Europe has slowed since 2018, with several European countries insisting they can take no more. The focus has shifted from facilitating new arrivals to making sure that those that have landed in Europe stay permanently. Last year, the European Union Court ruled that men avoiding military service in Syria must be granted asylum and cannot be deported back to Syria. This ruling only benefits Israel, while harming Europeans who wish to be rid of young male refugees and the associated problems of violence, rape and social disruption they bring with them. Conclusion: there is much more to this crisis than can be covered here, but everywhere you look, you can see the footprint of Israel. Jewish organizations and Jewish activists, whether on the foreign policy front in urging the United States to engage in more war, or on the humanitarian front in using NGOs to facilitate Refugee movement and permanently resettle Arabs, Africans and Iranians in Europe. Nationalist, activists in America and Europe must confront this reality head-on. We must resist calls from shills and right-wing Jewish organizations that try to use the natural resentment of Islam created by the migrant crisis to whip up support for Zionist aggression against the Syrian, Iranian and Palestinian people. Such conflicts will only result in more misery and more refugees flowing into Europe, where Israeli and Jewish NGOs will be waiting to welcome them, using the language of humanitarianism to turn the West into a dumping ground for people displaced by Jewish wars. Staying silent on matters relating to the Middle East conflict is not an option. The conflict in the Middle East is directly related to the future of Europe and America. Silence is equivalent to support for the status quo, which only favors Israel. Both the right and left heads of the Zionist serpent must be severed. Arab and Muslim migrants in Europe and America must be returned to their homelands where they can live in peace and security, free from Zionist aggression. European and American nationalists must work together to dismantle Zionist power structures in our native countries and to build a just and peaceful world, free of Jewish wars and population displacements.